Welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and today we're learning how to play Psy-Frames, but for now we're just going to go into the archetypal support. So first up, we're going to talk about the must-play card of all Psy-Frame decks. That is the Psy-Frame Driver, the normal monster, level 6 psychic type light monster, 2500 attack and 0 defense. Alright, you must play this card to play Psy-Frames. All of the hand traps, which is what the entire deck is based on, require this to be in your hand, deck, or graveyard. So there are some issues with playing cards like Pot of Desires, because you may banish your Psy-Frame drivers, and then you'll be unable to play the game at all. Additionally, the natural play of the cards in the deck may actually banish them for you when you don't want to. So hopefully there will always be one in your deck, and hopefully it doesn't really wind up in your hand, because it is just a level 6 normal monster. It doesn't really do anything. Let's take a look at the hand traps. Alright, they are all tuners. They're all hand traps, and in order to use all of them, you must have no monsters on your field. And whenever these the monsters summoned by the effects of the hand traps are banished at the end phase of the turn. Now, if for some reason they don't get banished at the end phase of the turn, they will get banished at the end phase of the following turn. So if they don't get banished because of Imperial Iron Wall being on the field, and then it gets destroyed during the next end phase, they will get banished. So if you use any, they get banished. And every one of them summons monsters to the field. So you can really only use one per turn, with a few exceptions where you activate one and then another effect is triggered that you would use another one before that one resolves. So we'll take a look at a scenario like that as well. First up is Psy-Frame Gear Alpha, which is this one. He has 500 attack and 0 defense. He is a light type psychic, just like all of the monsters, and he is a tuner. He is level 1. When your opponent normal summons or special summons a monster, but not when they flip summon a monster, so they can just set a monster and then flip it next turn to avoid activating this card effect. You can special summon this card and a Psy-Frame driver from your hand, deck, or graveyard, and if you do, add any Psy-Frame card from your deck to your hand except Psy-Frame Gear Alpha. So you can't just go alpha into alpha to play a tremendous amount of defense. You do have to go into something else, but you can search even out their trap card and use the trap card to search out another alpha and loop that way, but you can't do alpha into alpha. Psy-Frame Gear Alpha's activation condition is the same as Torrential Tribute, meaning if a monster is summoned by an inherent method, you can activate this card at any time in the chain following the resolution of the summon of a monster. It can also be activated if a monster is summoned via Chainlink 1, because the last thing that will have happened in the chain will be a monster was summoned. So if a monster is summoned by any card effect in Chainlink 2 or higher, like Chainlink 3 or 4, and then Chainlink 1 performs some sort of an action other than summoning a monster, you will not be able to activate Psy-Frame Gear Alpha. You'll also notice that this card says when, meaning that the timing can be missed, and that's why it needs to be summoned during Chainlink 1. Next up we have Psy-Frame Gear Beta, the only other level 1 tuner in the deck. When your opponent declares an attack, summon this card and a driver, and if you do, destroy the attacking monster, and if you do, end the battle phase. So the first thing you do is you summon the monster, this and the driver. It could be an attack and defense. It's the same thing for all of them, it doesn't really matter. If you do summon it, you destroy the attacking monster. Now, some monsters don't get destroyed, such as Chaos Max Dragon. You really should summon this in attack position if you have to stop the attack from a Chaos Max Dragon. And you only end the battle phase if you destroy the monster. So, there's some good things and some bad things about this card. The activation condition for Psy-Frame Gear Beta is the same as a Mirror Force. You can use it if your opponent declares an attack during the first chain that comes up following the declaration of an attack. So if for some reason you decide to activate another card first, you can still activate this card at some point during the chain. There are some ways this can go wrong though. There is a card that can search for a Psy-Frame, and if you activate that when your opponent declares an attack and search Psy-Frame Gear Beta, at the resolution of that chain, you can activate another quick effect, but you would not be able to activate Psy-Frame Gear Beta because the activation condition is no longer met. An attack was not just declared, a chain just resolved. So that is something to be careful about if you do play this deck. Alright, so let's move on to the level 2 tuners. Next up we have Psy-Frame Gear Gamma. Psy-Frame Gear Gamma is different from the other two because its activation condition must specifically be changed to another card. This one says when your opponent's monster activates a monster effect, you can special summon this card and a driver, and if you do, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that monster. So it's pretty neat. There's not much else to say about this card. It is a little better than the 2 for spells and traps because all monsters' effects activate, whether they're activated on normal summon or when discarded from your hand or anything of that nature, unlike spells and traps, which are only activated when they are placed face up on the field. So let's take a look at those. Next we have Psy-Frame Gear Delta. Now like I just mentioned, Psy-Frame Gear Delta can negate the activation of a spell card and destroy it. Unlike Gamma, who can negate any monster effect, Psy-Frame Delta can only negate the activation of a spell, meaning when it is placed face up on the field. So if you wanted to negate Cosmotown, you can negate it when it's first placed up on the field, but you cannot negate its effect to mulligan the hand, meaning shuffle Cosmos into the deck and draw cards, and you cannot negate the effect to add one of the banished Cosmo monsters from the banish zone back to the hand, because those are just triggered effects of that already face-up card. If you do negate the activation of Cosmotown, it goes straight from nowhere to the graveyard, because if you negate an activation of a card, it was never placed face-up on the field, so that's also pretty interesting to know. Let's take a look at the last Psy-Frame tuner. The last Psy-Frame tuner is Psy-Frame Gear Epsilon. Now, Epsilon does the same thing that Psy-Frame Gear Delta does when your opponent activates a trap card, meaning specifically places it face up on the field. They special summon this card and a Psy-Frame driver, and if you do, negate the activation, and if you do that, destroy that card. Once again, not particularly versatile. It's actually much worse because your opponent probably won't activate a trap card unless you have monsters on the field, so the odds of using this card are really low. In the right meta, I'm sure traps will be activated more often. Some Pendulum decks have teched this card to prevent your opponent from pulling off a draw phase card, Anti-Spell Fragrance. So every time a deck is in the format is playing some sort of card that shotguns their traps immediately, just uses them early, you might be able to use this card. Now, a big drawback to Psy-Frames is your opponent is likely to play a card such as Dimensional Barrier and Call Synchro. So one of the things you can do is play a card to target the Dimensional Barrier, forcing them to activate it, like a Twin Twister or MST, and that'll trick them into activating a trap, so you can activate Psy-Frame Gear Epsilon. Epsilon also has the benefit that you can activate it on your turn. You can activate them all on your turn. Well, you can activate Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon on your turn, but your opponent's activating cards on your turn is not likely unless it's a trap or a monster, so the Delta doesn't go off too often unless they're trying to destroy your field spell or your trap card. So we have one more monster to talk about. A recent release was Psy-Frame Multithreader. Multithreader is an effect monster. It's a light-type psychic, level 6. It has the opposite stats of Psy-Frame Driver. Its attack is 0 and its defense is 2500, and it has a couple of relevant aspects to it. First, this card is treated as Psy-Frame Driver when it's in your hand or in your graveyard, meaning you can special summon it with any of the Psy-Frame gears. When a Psy-Frame card or card would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can discard this card instead. So this is a Psy-Frame variant of Return of the Dragon Lords or Void Seer or any of those cards that prevent the destruction. That effect does not activate, so it cannot be negated by anything, so that's pretty cool, which is really useful because Psy-Frame's big thing is summoning Black Rose Dragon on your opponent's turn and destroying the field, but it's also nice to keep your cards alive at the same time. It does have another effect which is really good with a wonderful limited one spell card, Emergency Teleport, and that is if a Psy-Frame tuner is special summoned while this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon it, but banish it when it leaves the field. We haven't talked about the field spell yet. You may be wondering why you would want to summon these Psy-Frames, because they all get banished at the end of the turn. Well, the field spell actually prevents that from happening. Matter of fact, it makes it so all your Psy-Frames are really, really super plus. Let's take a look at the Psy-Frame field spell, Psy-Frame Circuit. Psy-Frame Circuit has several effects. It is a field spell. Being it's a field spell, it is speed spell 1, so it does trigger. So when it triggers, your opponent can respond to it. Here's what it does. If a Psy-Frame monster is summoned to your side of the field, you can, when this effect resolves, synchro summon using Psy-Frame monsters you control. So it will trigger and you will perform a synchro summon. Now when you synchro summon a Psy-Frame monster, that also used to trigger the field spell. If you had another tuner, you can synchro again. Due to the extra zone, there's nowhere to summon those Psy-Frames to, so you can't really pull off multiple summons anymore. You'd only be able to trigger this once because there's only one place you can put it. Even if you did trigger it twice, the first monster would occupy the extra zone and then the second effect wouldn't be able to resolve, so that's something important to know. Once you summon your Psy-Frames by negating a card effect or responding to a card effect, you have monsters on the field, and now you can't use your other Psy-Frames to protect your Psy-Frame circuit. So it's possible that your opponent will either Twin Twister your circuit or MST it or Ghost Ogre it when it triggers because you already have monsters on the field. It does have a second effect. It is a Honest-like effect, so an attack booster. If a Psy-Frame monster you control battles, you can discard one Psy-Frame card, one Psy-Frame monster at the start of the damage step to gain the discarded monster's attack points, and that lasts until the end of the turn. That means if you do draw the vanilla monster, that is the way to get the biggest attack boost out of Psy-Frame Circuit, so it does have some use if you do wind up drawing it. Now there's two more Psy-Frame main deck support cards, and they are both traps. The first one is probably the best trap in the game, in my opinion. It's really great. We have Psy-Frame Overload, which has two very relevant effects for this deck. First, once per turn, You can banish one Psy-Frame monster from your hand or face up on your field as a cost, and target one card on the field, and you can banish that card face down. And I'm sure you've probably determined that face down banished cards are much harder to get back than non-face down banished cards. So because cards are banished face down, they're not considered their original type of card. They're not considered monsters, spells, traps, or if they had any other kind of relevant text on them, they're not considered anything. Although that does kind of work against you with some cards, such as Eternal Soul, the trap card for Dark Magicians. That card triggers wherever it is when it's left the field, and if it's banished face down, it's not actually recognizable to activate its effect to destroy all their monsters. So that's the kind of card where this backfires against. Additionally, if you were to banish Denglong, First of the Yangzing, currently banned, but if it ever comes back, that would prevent it from floating, because that card activates when it leaves the field. A card that's banished face down is not aware that it left the field, because it doesn't seem to exist, and it's not public knowledge. Although, if you do have cards banished face down, you do have the ability to look at your own face down banished cards, so that's something you can do with Pot of Desires, as well as a card that might get hit by a Psy-Frame Overload. This card does have another effect. It has a graveyard effect. Once per turn, other than the turn that this card is sent to the graveyard, you can banish this card as a cost to add any other Psy-Frame card from your deck to your hand. And that works particularly well with the Synchro monster we're going to get to shortly. If you have this card in your graveyard some way other than sending it there, such as returning it to the graveyard, maybe with the Paleozoic Trap card, I can't pronounce the names of the Paleozoic Trap cards, the one that starts with an L, the one that unbanishes a card, that would return a card to the graveyard, meaning you can use it that turn. Additionally, the Psy-Frame Synchro monster does return it as well, so we're going to talk about that in a moment. But yeah, you can send this card to your graveyard with Foolish Burial of Goods and get cards right away. This card is really good in the graveyard or on the field. Let's take a look at the final trap card, which I don't really play. Is pretty interesting. This is Psy-Frame Accelerator. It was a later support card released. It has two effects. Once per turn, you can pay 500 life points as cost to target one Psy-Frame monster on your field and banish it until your next standby phase. Now this is one way to avoid your Psy-Frame monsters getting banished permanently. Perhaps you banish them yourself with your Psy-Frame Accelerator, you can then bring them back and then use them to attack, and then you can banish them again. Then you can do that once per turn, so if you were to summon a Psy-Frame on your opponent's turn, you can then banish your driver, and then it'll come back on your standby phase, and if you banish it then, and your opponent, if you wanted, you can do it more than once. Something I forgot to mention about the previous trap card, if you were to negate a card effect with your Psy-Frames, and they're on your field, at the end of the turn they're going to be banished anyway, so you can resolve your Psy-Frame Overload to banish one of them as a cost, to banish one of your opponent's cards face down. So let's move on to this has one more card effect. Once per turn, if another Psy-Frame card you control leaves the field, you can special summon one Psy-Frame monster from your hand. So this card kind of acts like a Firewall Dragon. You can make your Psy-Frames leave the field using either your Overload, or maybe they'll get attacked, or you can Synchro Summon with them, and that'll allow you to summon extra monsters from your hand, which is pretty cool. It's a pretty neat way to make use of the Psy-Frame Multi-Threaders effect, because you only have one emergency teleport if you're playing that card at all. Yeah, this is a card that requires much more exploration. Not a lot of people have used it too much, especially since the Link era has begun. Let's take a look at the two extra deck monsters. First up, we have Psy-Frame Lord Zeta. Zeta is really great. I love Zeta. He has several effects. He is a level 7 light-type psychic synchro monster, and because the Psy-Frame Gear Alpha and Beta are level 1, when you summon it with the driver while you have the field spell out, you can summon Psy-Frame Lord Zeta. Psy-Frame Lord Zeta has two effects. Both are really good. Once per turn, during either player's turn, you can target one special summoned attack position monster your opponent controls, banish both this card and that monster until your next standby phase. So, you can attack with him to kill one of their monsters, and then you can use his effect to remove one of their monsters from the field. Now in Link era, that's an excellent effect for any deck, because you can get him out of your extra zone, meaning you can make additional monsters in your extra zone. Being level 7 means he's particularly good at making things like Crystal Wing if you were to summon a level 1 tuner to go alongside him. Also, you can Synchro Summon with him into a Psy-Frame Lord Omega, which is the last monster we're going to talk about, to put him in the graveyard. Putting him in the graveyard lets you use his last effect. Let's get into his final effect. His final effect is, if this card is in your graveyard, you can target one other Psy-Frame card in your graveyard. Return this card to your extra deck, and if you do, add that target to your hand. You can use Beta to destroy opponent's attacking monster, Synchro Summon into Zeta, and if Zeta gets destroyed, you'll be able to use Zeta to recover your Psy-Frame Beta, or any other Psy-Frame card that's in your graveyard. You could even send your trap card or your spell card to the graveyard with Foolish Burial Goods, and then use Zeta to add them back to your hand. Now we have one more card to talk about, and that is everyone's favorite Psy-Frame Lord Omega, the only one that really makes appearances in other players' decks for other decks. It has 3 effects, all of which are really good. He is a level 8 light-type Synchro Psychic monster with 2800 attack and 2200 defense. Being a level 8 means he can be summoned very easily with Psy-Frame Gear Gamma, Delta, or Epsilon. Alright, his first effect says, once per turn during either player's main phase, you can banish this card and 1 random card from your opponent's hand until your next standby phase. So generally, what you will do is when you synchro him, you will immediately use his effect to take a card from your opponent's hand during the main phase, because most likely you will negate a spell card or a monster effect during the main phase while you have Psy-Frame Circuit on the field. And because he leaves the extra zone, when he returns to the field, he has to be placed in a main monster zone, just like Psy-Frame Zeta. If you keep him on your field during your turn, when your opponent's turn starts, they have priority in the main phase, so it is possible for them to set a card before you activate his effect to banish a card from their hand. So do be wary about that. His second effect is once per turn during your opponent's standby phase, you can target 1 banished card and return it to the graveyard. That includes face-down banished cards, but if you use your opponent's, you have to select one randomly because theirs is not public knowledge, so you cannot look at them. But if you play card Pot of Desires, you can look at your own face-down banished cards and return them to the graveyard. Now, the real benefit of this effect in the Psy-Frame deck is you can unbanish your Psy-Frame Overload and immediately use it to search again because the card is returned to the graveyard. Alright, Psy-Frame Lord Omega has one more effect, very relevant and worth discussing, so let's get to that. If this card is in your graveyard, you can target 1 other card in either player's graveyard and shuffle both that card and this card from your deck, from your graveyard into the deck. So he can reload any card from your graveyard to your deck. That includes Synchro Monsters or Psychic Field Zone, which is an excellent card for this deck. We'll talk more about additional support cards in a future video, but it can also be useful to disrupt your opponent. Perhaps they have Fairy Tale Snow in their graveyard. You can force them to activate it at that point in time. Another neat thing about Psy-Frame Lord Omega's effect is it's not once per turn, so if it gets negated, you can just use it again. It's a pretty fun thing that happens to Blue Eyes players occasionally. Anyways, stay tuned for the next video, and we'll see you next time.